Chapter 45, Claustrophobia. The first day I was called to court, the court bailiffs actually came all the way up to Little Max to get me. This was an arrangement that Livingston and Lewis, who both by now had been promoted to sergeants, worked out with the court movement deputies. As I was escorted down to the basement, all movement was stopped in the court tunnels until I was put in an elevator and taken to a holding tank. After being placed in a holding tank, I could literally hear my heart beating in my chest. I felt queasy, I was nervous, and my stomach felt like it was in a knot. I was actually starting to wonder if I would be able to handle this. What I was getting ready to do was considered one of the most despised, abhorrent, and vilest acts one could commit in this lifestyle. It's almost looked upon as being sacrilegious, committing the most cardinal sin. I was getting ready to get up in that dreaded box, the witness stand, and spill my guts. I hadn't seen DB, Looney, or Kramer since Second East in almost an entire year. I never even met Lokes, but all four of them were definitely going to be in the courtroom. I had spent the last couple weeks going over all my notes, studying the reports, and getting all my dates in order. But now that I was here, it seemed like all my thoughts were scrambled. The anxiety was throwing me off. After sitting in the holding cell for about 20 minutes, a deputy came back out and told me that my attorney wanted to talk to me. I was then escorted into an empty courtroom and sat down in a chair next to my attorney, Jack Gordon, who wanted to go over my plea agreement to make sure I understood everything and to get my signature. Up until that point, I had never signed it. The courtroom we were in wasn't being used that day, but the supervising deputy named Ed, who oversaw court movement, explained why I was being brought there. He said that when it was time for me to go in, they would walk me out the back of the courtroom from where the judge enters and exits, down the hallway where the chambers were, and into the back of the courtroom where the trial was being held. When the phone finally rang and Ed told me that it was time to go, I got up and headed for the hallway that led to the courtroom. I was finally just minutes away from sealing the deal and turning state's evidence against the NF. Never would I have imagined that I'd ever be doing this, but this was real and I was there. As we started walking down the hallway, I looked ahead and saw light reflecting on the floor that came from an open door. I knew this had to be the courtroom. When I finally made it to the door and walked in, everything hit me at once. The lights were exceptionally bright. There were spectators in the back. There were extra armed bailiffs present, and there were four defendants. Looney, Kramer, and Lokes all sat at one table with their attorneys, and DB sat at a separate table behind them with his attorney. I wondered how this would work out since DB had been moved to PC, but I assumed they would probably keep them separated. When I first walked into the courtroom, they were all talking to their attorneys, but as soon as they saw me, they stopped and just looked at me. I was expecting this, and this was something Turtle and I actually had talked about beforehand. I knew we'd make eye contact, but I told Turtle that I would look at each one of them in their eyes, and that's exactly what I did. I felt ashamed and embarrassed for doing what I was about to do, but I wasn't going to let them see this, nor was I going to put my head down. For me, the initial eye contact was probably one of the worst parts about this whole ordeal. These were people I used to run with. At one time, I considered them to be my brothers. But now, here all we were, on two different sides of the playing field. And I felt like the one who was betraying them. Which I was. Even though they had turned on me and betrayed me first, I still felt like I was helping the prosecution slaughter them, especially DB. He had done nothing but try to help me. He took a lot of heat and stuck his neck out for me, and now here I was, getting ready to drive the nails into his coffin. When I first looked at him and we locked eyes, his last words after our first encounter in Little Max echoed in the back of my mind. Just be honest about everything. And Boxer, whatever you do, don't make me regret this. Thinking about that made me feel like I was a real slimy ass dude. That I had no conscience or shame for showing my face. But I had to remind myself that DB made his choice and I had made mine. This was just the reality of it. As I sat down in the witness stand, I started to scan the entire courtroom. I was looking at all the faces and watching the attorneys shuffle their files in preparation for my testimony. The judge and the jury hadn't entered the courtroom yet, so there was about 5 long idle minutes with nothing to do but just sit there and look around. I looked at the faces in the audience, at the bailiffs, at the court clerk and the stenographer, at the DA Lance Doherty, and at Sergeant Lewis, who was seated at the DA's table. When the jury finally filed in, followed by the judge, and court was called into session, there was a brief moment where I felt overwhelmed with anxiety. It seemed like the lights got brighter, the courtroom got smaller, and my ears had lost all sense of hearing. I felt like I was being suffocated. Everything sounded muffled, almost as if I had suddenly been submerged underwater. I felt like standing up, walking out, and getting as far away from this macabre place as I could possibly go. I'm not a claustrophobic, but if I had to describe what that condition felt like, it was similar to being trapped inside of a small box. But I fought my way through it and somehow managed to compose myself. After the first couple of grueling minutes, I finally found my rhythm and became completely focused on every question asked of me. I blocked everything else out around me. It was almost like I had settled into some kind of deep trance. I ended up testifying for 5 full consecutive days. After a brief 402 hearing to determine if I qualified as an expert, I was sworn in as an expert witness in the areas of street and prison gangs. I had to explain almost 60 years of history as to how the Aryan Brotherhood, the ABs, the MA, the Mexican Mafia, the BGF, Black Guerrilla Family, and the NF, Nuestra Familia prison gangs in California evolved. I meticulously cataloged the entire structure of the organization, the philosophy, the ideology, recruitment procedures, weaponry, codes, sign language, communications, and the correlations between street and prison gangs were some of the main topics I was asked about. I had to cover it all, and these lawyers were tedious and relentless in their barrage of questions towards me. Besides DB, I felt bad for testifying against Looney because I considered him to be a good friend. It was unfortunate that he had gotten caught up in this mess, but I even felt worse after seeing how bad his lawyer dumped on him. I only answered the questions I was asked about him and tried to avoid providing more than I needed to. But his lawyer kept prying at me with question after question, digging a deeper hole for Looney. These attorneys were obviously underqualified to take on a case like this, but my attorney would later comment that it was actually entertaining watching me frustrate them. They tried every which way possible to crack me, but I answered every question exactly the opposite of how they wanted me to. At one point, toward the end of my cross-examination, one of the defense attorneys said, "Mr. Mendoza, do you hate these guys that are here in the courtroom today?" For the most part, after we made that initial eye contact, they had avoided making too much eye contact with me in front of the jury. This was probably at the urging of their lawyers, since they spent most of the time staring down at the table. This was a hard question to answer. I felt a huge lump form in my throat and my eyes actually started to burn. I said, "Nah, I don't hate them. I know this may be hard to understand, but they used to be my people. These were my brothers. These were people I would have died for at one time. I know what they think about me, and that's okay, because I understand that belief system, and I used to think like that. What I was doing was contrary to the NF's core principles of secrecy." I then added, "But I still don't wish nothing bad on them. I know that people's lives are being destroyed. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, their kids, and that's the sad irony about it. They're victims in this too. Unfortunately, they just haven't found a way to pull themselves out of it. Whatever happens when this case is over is not up to me, but I don't wish nothing bad on any of them. I needed to speak my piece. Regardless of what they thought about me, I did have a conscience." After I finally finished with my testimony, Turtle went in and finished in about half a day. At the conclusion of the trial, Kramer, Looney, and Lokes were found guilty on all charges. Kramer and Looney were both given life sentences. Lokes was given 13 years with 4 strikes. DB, on the other hand, came back with a hung jury. It was 11-1 for conviction, but this victory was short-lived. About 2 months after the verdicts were read, around the first week of December, I testified before a grand jury about my knowledge into the criminal activities of Charlie Campa and Sammy Wino Ramirez's street regiments. DB was also included in this indictment, and once again, I testified about his involvement with Kramer's regiment, all the business I was exposed to in Second East, and all his history within the NF. Turtle also testified at this hearing. By this time, several other individuals involved in some of these investigations had also dropped out and agreed to testify in front of the grand jury as well. Some of these individuals included Chris Chino Clip, Isaac Lefty Lastra, David Gato Lastra, Elicio Listo Martinez, Jesse Conejo Rodriguez, and Enrique Puerco Rodriguez. At the conclusion of this hearing, the grand jury returned an indictment against 22 members and associates of those two regiments. Those indicted were Sammy Wino Ramirez, Charlie Brown Campa, Rodolfo Dancing Bear Miramontes, Marco Huero Abundis, Robert Happy Perez, Jason Pocho Silvas, Ricky Perez, Michael Raton Ortiz, Danny Chinito Castillo, Isaac Gato Marquez, Robert Barraza, Randy Chico Cesares, Sonny Lujan, Mike Big Mike Chandler, Hilario Eli Solki, Juan Trigger Gonzalez, Vinny Monster Thierry, David Ramirez, Cecilia C.C. Fonseca, and Chris Alagui. A couple months later, sometime in or around April 2009, I went in front of a second grand jury and testified about my knowledge into the criminal activities of Lorenzo Lencho Guzman Street Regiment. At the conclusion of this hearing, the grand jury returned an indictment against 29 members and associates of his regiment. Those indicted were Lorenzo Lencho Guzman, Clayton Shorty Clark, Greg Joker Guzman, David Pookie Bermudez, Fernando Nando Miranda, Felipe Flip Yanez, Jack Droopy Ochoa, Moses Mo Rodriguez, Anthony Gordy Solis, Nicholas Primo Mendez, Hector Wino Maldonado, Jonathan Nipper Bynum, Aldo Droopy Martinez, Tina Marie Hernandez, Ruby Gonzalez, Danny Guzman, Desiree Changa Herrera, Christina Tamburinino, Sabrina Hernandez, Cindy Mendoza, Leslie Frost, Stephanie Guzman, Vanessa Carrasco, Kelly Namowitz, Frank Joker Ruiz, Jerry Bones Chavez, Frank Manos Gutierrez, Benjamin Big Happy Mendez, and Carlos Roman. Aside from some of the other cooperating witnesses who had also testified in the Campa and Ramirez indictments, one of the biggest star witnesses that emerged in the indictment against Lencho was his own wife, Debbie Corrales, who wreaked havoc on Lencho's entire crew. From his manpower to his connections, all the way down to members of his family. And he was squarely to blame for this. Lencho had become so careless and consumed with collecting money and continuing to control the streets that he completely lost sight of security and exposed everybody. He definitely made Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Livingston's jobs a whole lot easier. All they had to do was sit back and pick off all the names and identities of the people he was slovenly exposing on the phone. After gathering an abundant amount of information and monitoring several hundred phone calls, Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Livingston had enough to issue another search warrant for Debbie's residence. Upon conducting the search, they found ledger sheets, cell phones, letters, gang-related communications, and other evidence substantiating everything Lencho had Debbie doing over the phone. Debbie was then given a chance to cooperate or sync with Lencho and everybody else that he exposed. Debbie finally realized that she was nothing more than a pawn to Lencho's needs and that all he cared about was collecting his money. She agreed from that day forward to cooperate, and that's exactly what she did. Debbie knew all the players, all the suppliers, all the codes, and she had gained something that would become invaluable: trust. They all had trusted her and had gotten used to her because of Lencho. When Charlie, Sammy, Weddle, Shorty, or any of the other regiment members went to his house to discuss business, Lencho would insist that she be present. Even in light of the fact that some of these C's expressed their concerns about it and asked that she be told to leave the room, Lencho resisted. "I trust her with my life. She doesn't have to go anywhere," he told them. Other C's like Kramer would also be critical of how Lencho involved Debbie in NF business. I overheard Kramer tell DB in Second East that Lencho brought Debbie to NF meetings and would have her sit on his lap so she could watch him assert his authority. Kramer said, "This dude would have her sitting on his lap during some of our meetings, and everybody knew he was just trying to impress her, to show her he was in control and had an RC position." Lencho became so arrogant and self-absorbed with impressing her that he forced the issue and exposed everyone to her. Now, the worst case scenario was about to play out. Debbie was flipping, and he was solely responsible for everything she knew. Once they had her in pocket, Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Livingston devised a list of members and associates based on the phone calls and had Debbie reel them all in. One by one, she went down the list until they had gotten everybody. She either called from her phone that had a recording device attached to it, or she wore a wire and surreptitiously coerced them all into incriminating themselves. And this girl was a natural. She knew exactly what to say and how to extract the information out of them. They spoke in code and used subterfuge in an attempt to legitimize the conversation. However, Debbie would blurt out a word here and there and act like it was an innocent slip-up. Later on, I would read one of the police reports that detailed her statements, and some of the things she said was hilarious. She described how Lencho used to go on his drug-crazed tirades after smoking PCP and some of the ridiculous things he would do. On one of these occasions, she said he got so blasted that he started jumping up and down on the couch saying, "I am the general, I am the general." Because of Debbie, Lencho's incompetent tenure inevitably culminated in not only bringing down him, but also everyone else around him. When Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Livingston were confident they had all the information they needed, they went to Debbie's house in the middle of the night with moving trucks and packed up everything in the house. Before the sun came up that morning, she was flown somewhere across state lines and into the witness protection program. Everything Lencho had been doing for the last couple of months was about to come back tenfold, and Debbie's role would later be insurmountable.